Military analyst Denys Popovych is joining our broadcast. Denys, hello? We're glad to see you.
Hi.
Could you please tell us about this attack on Kyiv? It was probably one of the largest combined attacks in recent times. Definitely not just in months, but probably even in, entire seasons. There are already 19 dead, unfortunately, and more than 10 people are still trapped under the rubble, possibly even more. In other words, their fate is unknown. And 4 children were killed by Russia last night. It's important to say this out loud. Could you please tell us what tactics the Russians are using now? They had been stockpiling missiles for a certain period, so are we now facing regular shelling, or what does the situation look like?
Well, our previous shelling was on July 31st in Kyiv. We remember that its consequences were not as tragic. There were strikes, a 5-story building collapsed in the same area of the city, and there were also dozens of casualties. Now we are indeed witnessing, yes, the very clear and undeniable results of today's intense and continuous shelling. There was also a strike on an apartment building. I'm very afraid that the 19 people currently listed as dead is not the final number, since this is a residential building. And I'm very afraid that, of course, I don't want to jinx it, as they say, but unfortunately the reality is that there could be even more dead and injured. So we see that the enemy is deliberately targeting residential areas, residential buildings. It's strange what motivates them. Maybe someone is directing these strikes, some kind of moles. There are rumors that someone is telling them to hit these particular buildings with missiles. But the fact that these strikes are being specifically directed at these buildings, we can see that the attack is targeted and concentrated. This is absolutely obvious. In other words, the strike is intentionally aimed at residential areas and the civilian population. As of today, I have said this before. I have said it repeatedly, and I will keep repeating it. The enemy is trying to achieve its objectives in 3 directions. The first direction is a ground offensive, aimed at capturing as much territory from Ukraine as possible. The second is informational pressure. This is actually a very broad topic. It also exists in the diplomatic sense. The Russian press is involved, as are agents of influence and so on. And the third direction is precisely these strikes on rear cities. In other words, these strikes are specifically aimed at the civilian population. Their purpose is first to undermine the rear, and second, to send a message to the West that no matter what agreements are reached, those agreements will, as they say, be trampled, spat upon, and reduced to dust. So do as we say, accept our terms, otherwise we will continue to bomb peaceful cities, and no one will do anything, no one will stop us. But so far we see that this tactic, unfortunately, is not yielding any results. That is, all the agreements that were reached there, or at least announced, whether they were actually reached or just announced a week ago after Alaska and after Washington, we can see how the Russian Federation responded to them.
Yes, you are absolutely right that many experts predicted there would be no shelling of Kyiv after that meeting in Alaska. Supposedly, Putin was brought to heel, but here is the result. All right. They also say that drones with jet, as far as I understand, jet engines were used. So these are high-speed unmanned aerial vehicles. So what does this mean? Does it mean there will be more shelling, more hits? How well have we learned, or not learned, to counter these drones? Please tell us about the military aspect.
Well, for now, there aren't many of these drones. Yes, they have been used. Yes, we've heard about it. Those who followed the monitoring channels, which were commenting, in fact, on the approach of these aerial targets to Kyiv and other cities. So these drones were used, but in small numbers. What are the specific features? The thing is, these drones make life much more difficult for mobile fire teams, which until now have been one of the main means of countering these aerial attacks. Second point, the anti-aircraft drones that we are currently deploying are also useless against jet-powered drones. Why is that? Because their speed is simply too high. A jet-powered drone can reach speeds of 400 or even 500 kilometers per hour, whereas an anti-aircraft drone can only reach speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour. We understand perfectly well that it's impossible to shoot down a target moving at a higher speed with a projectile that moves slower. It's completely logical. And in fact, this higher speed also complicates reaction time and makes the work of mobile fire teams much more difficult. How can you shoot them down? Well, no, there is no miracle weapon. Nothing is absolute. It is possible and necessary to use anti-aircraft missile systems, use jet aircraft armed with air-to-air missiles, and if possible, use anti-aircraft artillery. In other words, there are means available, including manpads, since a jet engine provides a fairly typical signature for manpads to be effective. Therefore, the means to counter this threat exist. They are available. There is absolutely nothing particularly surprising or unexpected about them at all. But as we can clearly see, the enemy is increasingly employing more and more insidious means to terrorize the innocent civilian population. So this is also a very undeniable fact that we must acknowledge.
By the way, here's something interesting. GUR fighters have actually struck a Caliber cruise missile carrier in the Sea of Azov. Do we have the capability to do this on a regular basis? Could you tell us, please?
Well, actually, it depends on many factors. And by the way, it's been a very long time since any strikes were carried out against ships. I can't even remember the last time it happened. Maybe it was back in 2023. So after such a certain pause, yes, quite a significant and lengthy one, we're now seeing a successful attack on a small missile ship, which, by the way, carries 8 Kaliber missiles. As far as I understand, it was not sunk. The ship sustained damage but managed to escape. But we can see that obviously these ships have gotten so brazen that action really had to be taken. Why? Because clearly this ship was preparing to launch Kaliber missiles, and we would have suffered even more if those missiles had been launched. That's why this strike was carried out. Can this be done on a regular basis? It depends. But these ships, as we can see, they leave their ports only very occasionally. This one showed up, unfortunately for itself, in the Sea of Azov and got what was coming to it. But this doesn't happen that often. So obviously what's needed here are long-range weapons that could specifically strike at the bases where these ships are stationed. Such weapons have now appeared. Let's see how they will be used.
And clearly the war, even in terms of aerial combat, is not being fought on equal terms, because for now Russia is carrying out direct terror against the Ukrainian capital. Here we have a concrete result: a strike on important oil facilities belonging to the occupiers. For example, the Novokuybyshevsk oil refinery was attacked by drones in the city of Samara and the Samara region, causing a fire there. There was also an attack in the Krasnodar region, specifically on the so-called Afipsky oil refinery. Denys, could you please tell us about these strikes? Do you see that there is no ban on striking Russian oil facilities?
Well, even if there is one, it is being successfully circumvented, right? In other words, it is simply being ignored, because we can see that these strikes are being carried out and they are very effective. Today, Matter stated that according to his calculations, 21% of Russian oil facilities have already been put out of commission, and we are seeing concrete results. This is a fuel crisis on the territory of the Russian Federation and in the temporarily occupied territories, Sevastopol region, Crimea, and so on. In other words, there is no free sale of gasoline. If it is available, it is only in limited quantities and with ration cards. So the Russian Federation wanted to restore the Soviet Union, and in a way they're succeeding, but there's a catch, right? It depends on how they're restoring it and which aspects of the Soviet Union's way of life they're bringing back, but they haven't managed to bring back ration cards until now. That's why the strikes need to continue, so that the fuel crisis escalates to its full extent and can have a direct impact on the actual conduct of hostilities. It's important to understand that this impact will be felt last of all because the Russian leadership will do everything possible, no matter the cost, to ensure to the greatest extent that their army, which is waging war against Ukraine, is fully supplied.
Now let's talk about Crimea. On the night of August 27th, explosions were heard. This was reported by the so-called governor of Sevastopol, Razvozhayev. We're talking about 11 o'clock at night. The area of Osheretnaya Bay. There were also reports of drones flying over Yevpatoria, Saki, and Novofedorivka. Occupied Crimea was shaken by drones that night. In recent days, we've been discussing a very successful operation involving the explosion of a train, a convoy that was transporting gasoline and diesel for the occupiers. After that, the logistics of the occupying forces were attacked. Please comment on these strikes and clarify whether Crimea is becoming a new serious direction, because let's be honest, in recent months there was rather little information about it, but now it's being hit more and more often.
Well, it never stopped being a serious direction. It's just that it isn't always targeted. It's a serious direction. This is a territory that is in the focus of our attention, and strikes are being carried out on it, on those targets located in this territory, specifically targets of the occupying army. There is in fact a clear sequence here. That is, the air defense system is taken out first. Yes, we've repeatedly seen reports like that. After that, the air corridor is essentially cleared, and then drones and other strike assets are launched, which then hit ground targets. Regarding logistics, by the way, today we were talking about oil refineries. In addition to oil refineries, strikes are also being carried out on key railway stations within Russian territory. A key railway station is a very important logistical facility, and if it is taken out of operation even for a short time, the train schedule is seriously disrupted. And this can have a direct impact on logistics in the interests of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The same goes for Crimea. Jankoy, for example, is a key railway station. Let's remember peacetime when we traveled to Crimea, all the trains going to the peninsula, whether through Melitopol or through Kherson, their routes still converged in Jankoy. That's why it's a key station, which essentially plays the same role as similar facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation. Next, there's a very effective practice of striking tankers and fuel trains. You mentioned them earlier. They are simply shot up by drones. These trains go up in flames. Yes, and fires like that are very difficult to put out. That's the first major delay. While they're putting out the fire, time passes. Then it turns out that because of the high temperatures from the fire, the tracks have been damaged. The tracks need to be repaired, and that takes even more time. So we're talking about several days, if not more. So all these strikes are aimed at logistics, and together with the strikes on oil refineries, and together with the strikes on the Russian Federation's military-industrial facilities, each one serves its own purpose.
Denys, I also want to discuss with you what Julian Röpke, an analyst from Bild, wrote. Of course, he's someone whose opinion can always be questioned because he's written all sorts of things. But nevertheless, he is essentially insisting that the Russian summer offensive is coming to an end and ending unsuccessfully. Do you agree with this assessment? Please explain your position.
Well, the discussion was about how his article was presented in Bild and how it was translated, suggesting that the offensive had stalled. That was more or less how the opponent of the offensive was portrayed. I wouldn't say that it has stalled. It is still ongoing after all. That is, there is both some advancement and a buildup of troops. And no one has forgotten that Pokrovsk remains the focus of the Russian army. So the offensive is still ongoing. However, it is true that it is not currently achieving the objectives that were set for it. And we remember that the deadline for capturing Pokrovsk was September 1st. Despite the fact that certain groups of Russian troops were indeed observed within the city limits, Pokrovsk still stands. Yes, it is destroyed. Yes, it's uninhabitable there. Yes, it's semi-encircled with Smai, with Smina, with Smirnograd, but it still stands, and it definitely won't be taken by September 1st. And Konstantinovka definitely won't be taken by September 1st either, even though those objectives were also set. So no, the offensive has not stopped. It continues, but it is failing to achieve its objectives. In other words, it's not meeting its deadlines. That is, as of today, the goals and successes the enemy plan to achieve, they are not managing to accomplish them.
Denys, to wrap up, it's unpleasant news, but I think it's important to discuss it. Russia struck a Ukrainian Navy ship. One sailor was killed, and as I understand it, either already a participant of this mission, speaker, and they are still searching for the other sailors. The spokesperson for the Ukrainian Navy, Dmytro, Ukrainian Armed Forces Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk reported this. Could you please provide more details? Why do we allow such strikes to happen? And well, basically, how do we deal with this?
Well, as I understand it, the strike was carried out by an unmanned maritime drone, a Russian one. The question of whether we allow it or not in general.
So the Russians managed to use our know-how with maritime drones at sea, is that right?
Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, yes. They have been working for a long time on developing this weapon. We know that the enemy is learning and the enemy is trying to adopt our best practices. And today we see that apparently the strike was carried out specifically by a Bek, an unmanned maritime drone, a drone, yes, and that's what led to these results. Moreover, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation claimed to have sunk this ship. They referred to it as the medium reconnaissance ship Simferopol. I'm not making any claims here, so to speak. I'm simply relaying the information that was reported by Russian sources. But the fact that the ship was hit has been confirmed by our official sources, so we can talk about it. Well, yes, unfortunately, the Russian Federation is now mastering the use of BECs, unmanned maritime drones, and this is a challenge. How exactly can we effectively counter this significant threat? Well, as far as I am personally aware, and this information has indeed been widely reported, we already possess unmanned maritime drones in the FPV style. Yes, so, well, perhaps with the crucial help of these FPV drones, we could potentially fight against Russian surface drones. And to sum up, I can say that we are moving toward a situation where robot battles will also take place at sea. Right now, they are being fought very actively in the air and to some extent on land as well, yes. And now we are entering an era where drones will also be fighting at sea. That is, there will be naval battles involving robots.
We'll see. Denys, thank you very much for joining us on the air. Denys Popovych, military analyst, was on the air with Ukraine today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye for now and see you soon. Take care and have a wonderful day.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.